Let's review our methodology. We are working on the first pillar of the bridge between the world of the Bible and the world of today. State it is the first pillar of the bridge. And there are 5 components of that pillar. You have now done some work in establishing the context and examining the author's theology. Now we will do a little work with the bones of the sermon. A good sermon skeleton gives the sermon structural integrity. In this video, I will address 2 foundational elements for the bones of a sermon. The bones of a sermon give the message that structural framework. However, we must be careful not to make the bones so painfully obvious that the sermon looks emaciated. The bones are important as a framework, but fleshing out the sermon makes the message meaningful to the people. The 2 foundational elements for the sermon require us to, number 1, identify the unit of thought, and number 2, develop the hinges on which the passage swings. The preacher must identify the boundaries of the text and block out the structure of the text. Let's start with identifying the unit of thought. Expository preaching is unit of thought preaching. We are trying to explain the unit of thought that the original author expressed. All writing is built on ideas. An idea is a complete unit of thought. So if you're going to preach the ideas of the Bible, we must identify the units of thought in the Bible. How do we determine a unit of thought? Let's ask some questions. Number 1, does the passage contain one big idea? The Bible is full of ideas. There are big ideas, there are little ideas. Many preachers get caught up in all the little ideas and neglect the big ideas of the Bible. So every passage has many little ideas in it. As I have taught preaching classes over the years, I have found that many pastors have a hard time locating the big ideas in a passage. I tell them, look, find the big idea in a passage, and they're confused by all the little ideas that they see. There are too many ideas, people tell me. The result is that much preaching focuses on the little ideas, and our listeners go away with lots of good thoughts, but no eternal truths for life. If we major on the minors, then we lose sight of eternal truth. So a unit of thought contains one big idea. Unit, you notice, is singular. One big idea is what gives the unit of thought its strength and its integrity. Second, can the passage stand alone as an independent thought? A phrase or a clause cannot stand alone. A sentence is a complete idea, subject and complement. But is it an independent thought? Does it stand alone, or is it dependent on what comes before and after to make some sense? Number 3, does the passage have a beginning and an ending? Can you identify a starting point that sets it apart from the context and an ending point that concludes the unit of thought before starting a new thought? 4, does your translation identify your passage as a paragraph? This is a simple one to use, a simple tool to use. The editors of our English translations create paragraphs for us from the biblical text. Obviously, the original text did not have paragraphs or verses. These are editorial decisions. They're not inspired, of course. However, they can be one of the simplest tools we can use to help us identify units of thought. 5, Can your passage be broken down into smaller ideas? A sentence is an idea because it contains both a subject and a complement. But that idea may be all over the moment you say it. It doesn't go anywhere. To be a preachable idea, a unit of thought, the idea must be divisible. You must be able to divide the big idea into smaller ideas to have a complete unit of thought. Now let's look at developing the hinges. Every unit of thought swings on hinges you locate in the passage. Hinges allow the door to open into the biblical text so that you can see how the author developed his unit of thought. The hinges form the connections from one smaller idea to another smaller idea, connecting all the smaller ideas to the big idea. What are the hinges in a unit of thought? How do we find those hinges? Well, we have to find the connectives in the text, the conjunctions. We have to identify the repetition of words and phrases. We identify the changes in character or speaker. And we visualize the plot loop in a narrative passage. These are the 4 tools we use to locate the hinge points of the passage. So let's start with finding the connectives in the text. Connectives are the hinges on which the passage swings. The conjunctions form the structural clues in the passage. There are a wide variety of such clues, and they are important to structural analysis, really all out of proportion to their relative size. Each connective should start a new line in your diagram. The following is a simple but certainly not exhaustive list of connectives. You have it on your screen. Then we need to identify the repetition of words and phrases. And then we need to identify the changes in character or sequence. The speaker is going to change. This person is speaking here, and then it changes to another speaker, particularly in narrative literature. Those are hinge points. Any repetition of words or phrases becomes a hinge point because it flags a new, smaller idea. And then finally, we visualize the plot loop in a narrative passage. The plot loop sequence is particularly important in narrative literature. All stories contain plot loops. And of course, the Bible is full of stories. So visualizing the plot loop can help us grasp the structure of a passage. Eugene Lowry developed what has become known as Lowry's loop to help us with plot structure. Plot thickens when someone or something upsets the equilibrium, disrupts it, leading us to analyze the discrepancy. The next step in the plot sequence is disclosing the resolution of the problem, which leads to experience the gospel or good news. The plot sequence ends with anticipating the consequences. Lowry's students paraphrased the plot loop in a fun and graphic way with oops, ugh, aha, wee, and yay to describe the sequences of a plot loop. And these are the things you are looking for, particularly in narrative literature, although there's some elements of it also in didactic literature, when you're trying to understand the bones, the structure, the framework of your unit of thought. I use a block diagram to visualize the structure of the text. In didactic material, like the epistles, the diagram will hinge more on the connectives and the repetition of words or phrases. In narrative material, stories, the diagram will hinge more on change of character and the plot loop sequence. The tool focuses on blocking the text into the segments of the unit of thought by seeing the hinges in the text. And the goal is to fit the block diagram on one page in order to visualize the text. So really, if you're diagramming, blocking out a long section like a narrative, something that might take a chapter or two or even three, you will summarize the blocks by identifying the hinge points. Your objective is to get it all on one page and just block out the sections for yourself so that you can see it, so that you can visualize it. We're going to work on developing a block diagram. The purpose is to visualize the flow of thought, to picture the structure. How do we do it? What techniques do we use? The first thing we do is divide the paper into vertical columns. Write or copy the words of your text into the paper, onto the paper, in order of the text. Each hinge starts a new line. Major ideas are written to the left. Minor ideas are written to the right. Parallel ideas should begin in the same column. As the corresponding idea so that they are parallel. Make sure you identify the translation and reference at the head of the sheet, since that can make a huge difference in your blocking of the text. Once again, if you're doing narrative or you're doing large segments of Scripture, you aren't going to write every word. You're going to block out those sections so that you see the bones of the passage. So you will now use the workbook to complete 2 exercises in blocking out the text for your sermon. I've already done the block diagramming for you with the text in the workbook, in the Greek with the transliteration. Although feel free to disagree with how I block the text if you see it differently yourself. You're the preacher. You're doing the exegesis. These are examples intended to help, but they're certainly not inspired. So this is an interpretive exercise that you will do in this assignment. As you see the text and as you identify the hinges, you may see them differently than I have blocked it out or another preacher. For the most part, we're usually fairly close, but there are times when we disagree, and that's because this process of determining the bones of a sermon is an interpretive exegetical process.